Let's rewind time, far before anyone had heard of the CIA, MI6, or Mossad, to a cold October night in 1917. Petrograd is in chaos. The Bolsheviks have stormed the Winter Palace. Tsarist rule, centuries of monarchy, is gone. A new world is being born, one built on revolution, ideology, and control. And right from the start, the men building it understood one thing clearly. To hold power, they needed intelligence. Not just soldiers, not just propaganda. They needed eyes and ears everywhere. They needed an invisible hand to crush enemies before they even appeared. That's where this story begins. Not with the KGB, but with its ancestors, the Cheka. Created in December 1917 under Felix Dzerzhinsky, the Cheka was the Bolshevik secret police, brutal, relentless, and loyal only to Lenin's revolution. Their mission wasn't just to spy. It was to destroy enemies of the state. Anyone who opposed communism, questioned the revolution, or simply refused to obey. They didn't bother with courts or trials. If the Cheka decided you were a threat, you disappeared. Thousands were executed during the Red Terror, often without even knowing what they were accused of. Over time, the Cheka evolved, first into the GPU, then the NKVD under Joseph Stalin. Each new version became more sophisticated, more powerful, and more deeply woven into Soviet life. By the 1930s, the NKVD wasn't just a security service. It was the state's sword and shield, running labor camps, conducting mass deportations, assassinating political opponents abroad, and building one of the most extensive spy networks the world had ever seen. Stalin's secret weapon under Stalin, intelligence wasn't just about gathering information. It was about survival, for the regime and for Stalin himself. The NKVD's reach extended everywhere, into factories, farms, universities, embassies, and even Soviet families. Children were encouraged to report on their parents. Neighbors spied on neighbors. Fear was the glue that held the country together, and the NKVD was the architect of that fear. But it wasn't just domestic. The Soviet Union knew that the real threat came from outside. Capitalist states determined to crush communism before it spread. So the NKVD built a foreign intelligence empire. They infiltrated Western governments, stole industrial secrets, and penetrated military alliances. Their spies were so deeply embedded in foreign institutions that many of them stayed hidden for decades. One of the most successful examples, the Cambridge Five, a group of British elites recruited by Soviet intelligence in the 1930s. They weren't common spies. They were insiders, diplomats, journalists, even senior members of British intelligence itself. Names like Kim Philby, Guy Burgess, and Donald Maclean became legendary. They passed mountains of classified material to Moscow, including details on British and American nuclear programs. Philby even rose to become the head of MI6's anti-Soviet division, a Soviet mole running Western counterintelligence. That's how deep Soviet infiltration went, and it was just getting started. World War II. Espionage as a weapon. World War II wasn't just fought with tanks and bombs, it was fought with spies. And for the Soviets, intelligence was vital to survival. NKVD networks provided critical information about Nazi plans, troop movements, and new weapons. Soviet agents penetrated German intelligence, sabotaged supply lines, and even assassinated key officials. One of the most significant coups was the infiltration of the Manhattan Project, America's top-secret program to build the atomic bomb. Soviet spies like Klaus Fuchs and Theodore Hall smuggled crucial information to Moscow, allowing the USSR to develop its own nuclear weapon years ahead of schedule. That intelligence changed the balance of power forever, and it showed that Soviet espionage wasn't just effective, it was world-changing. When the war ended, the United States and the Soviet Union, former allies, became bitter enemies. And in this new world of nuclear standoffs and ideological battles, intelligence was more important than ever. In 1954, the NKVD's successor, the MGB, merged with military intelligence elements to form a new agency, the Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti, the KGB. And that's where the legend truly begins. The KGB, sword and shield of the party. The KGB wasn't just another intelligence service. It was the ultimate instrument of state power, designed not just to protect the Soviet Union, but to expand its influence around the globe. Its motto said it all: the sword and shield of the Communist Party. From its headquarters at Lubyanka in Moscow, the KGB ran operations across 5 continents. It had 5 main directorates. First Chief Directorate, FCD, Foreign Intelligence, Espionage, Recruitment, Sabotage, and Influence Abroad. Second Chief Directorate, Counterintelligence, rooting out foreign spies and traitors inside the USSR. Third Chief Directorate, Military Security, monitoring the armed forces for disloyalty. Fifth Chief Directorate, Ideological Control, suppressing dissent, censoring media, and crushing political opposition. Seventh Directorate, Surveillance, the eyes and ears of the state, watching diplomats, dissidents, and even fellow officers. The KGB was everywhere. It controlled who could travel, who could publish, who could speak. It placed informants in universities, factories, newspapers, and embassies. It monitored phone calls, intercepted mail, and followed foreign diplomats 24/7. And if you spoke out against the state, the KGB had a file on you, and they would use it. But the KGB was more than just a police force. It was a strategic weapon, and its most powerful operations happened far beyond Soviet borders. Cold War chessboard, global operations. Begin by the late 1950s. The Cold War was in full swing, and the KGB was on the offensive. Its agents infiltrated NATO, the CIA, and even the US nuclear arsenal. It cultivated deep cover illegals, spies who lived under false identities in Western cities for decades, posing as ordinary citizens while gathering intelligence or influencing policy. One of the KGB's most important missions was active measures, a term that covered everything from propaganda and disinformation to sabotage and political manipulation. They forged documents, planted fake news stories, spread conspiracy theories, and funded political movements, all designed to weaken Western unity and sow distrust in democratic institutions. For example, during the 1960s, the KGB spread a false story that the CIA had invented the AIDS virus as a biological weapon, a lie that still lingers today. They forged documents proving U.S. plans for nuclear war. They faked letters between Western politicians to cause diplomatic scandals. And they did it all while staying invisible. But espionage wasn't limited to politics. The KGB targeted science, technology, and industry too. They stole jet engine designs, missile guidance systems, and computer technology, often years before the West realized it had been compromised. In many cases, Soviet weapon systems were built with stolen Western blueprints. The KGB also ran some of the most audacious spy exchanges and double-agent operations in history. Perhaps the most famous was Oleg Penkovsky, a Soviet military intelligence officer who spied for the West in the early 1960s. His intelligence on Soviet missile capabilities was critical during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and likely helped prevent nuclear war. The KGB eventually caught him. He was executed, but not before changing the course of history, crushing dissent at home, while the KGB was active abroad. Its role inside the Soviet Union was just as significant, and often even more ruthless. It wasn't enough to stop foreign spies. The party needed to control thought. Writers, scientists, priests, dissidents, anyone who criticized the regime was monitored, harassed, or imprisoned. Some were sent to psychiatric hospitals under fabricated diagnoses. Others were exiled. Some simply vanished. Perhaps the most famous dissident was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Nobel Prize-winning author of The Gulag Archipelago. His books exposed the horrors of Stalin's labor camps and challenged the legitimacy of the Soviet system. The KGB harassed him relentlessly, bugged his home, seized his manuscripts, and eventually forced him into exile. And yet, the repression worked. Fear kept society obedient. And that obedience kept the party in power. By the early 1960s, the KGB wasn't just an intelligence service. It was a state within a state. It controlled information, shaped global politics, and enforced ideological purity at home. It had more agents, more informants, and more influence than any intelligence service before or since. And it wasn't slowing down. The next phase, the 1960s to the 1980s, would see the KGB wage a global shadow war against the West. There would be assassinations, sabotage, deep cover moles, and psychological operations that changed how the world thought about truth itself. And as the Cold War reached its peak, the KGB would become not just a spy agency, but the ultimate weapon in the Soviet Union's global struggle for dominance. Part 2. Masters of the Shadow Game, 1954-1985. By the mid-1950s, the KGB had become more than a security agency. It was the heartbeat of the Soviet state. It was everywhere and nowhere, feared and respected, hated and admired. Its agents moved like ghosts through the corridors of foreign power, pulling strings that shaped history without anyone realizing. And if the CIA was the blade of American influence, the KGB was its mirror, sharper, older, and often one step ahead. This was the golden age of espionage, a global chessboard where the stakes were world domination and the pawns were often human lives. The deep cover, illegals, ghosts. Among us, the KGB's most sophisticated weapon wasn't its assassins or its saboteurs, it was its illegals. These were deep cover agents, often planted in the West for decades under false identities. They didn't wear uniforms. They didn't use Russian names. They became part of the societies they were sent to destroy, marrying locals, raising families, working normal jobs, all while feeding Moscow with intelligence. If they were caught, the Soviet Union would deny they even existed. One of the most legendary illegals was Rudolf Abel, real name William Fisher, who lived in New York for nearly a decade posing as an artist. He transmitted critical U.S. nuclear and military secrets to Moscow until the FBI caught him in 1957, Abel's eventual exchange, for downed U-2 pilot Francis. Gary Powers, on a foggy Berlin bridge, became one of the most iconic moments of the Cold War, but Abel was just one of thousands. Soviet illegals penetrated NATO, the Pentagon, even American defense contractors. They recruited scientists, engineers, and bureaucrats, sometimes for money, sometimes for ideology. And the beauty of their system was patience. The KGB would plant an illegal in a foreign country and wait. 5 years, 10, 20. They'd only activate them when the time was right, and when they did, the damage was devastating. Operation Seat 12. Psychological warfare and active measures. If the CIA mastered coups and covert wars, the KGB mastered perception. They called it active measures. Operations designed not just to collect intelligence, but to shape reality itself. The KGB wasn't content with stealing secrets. They wanted to control how people thought about those secrets. One of the most infamous examples was Operation Seat 12, a long-term plan to discredit the Vatican and the Catholic Church. Soviet agents forged documents suggesting that Pope Pius XII had collaborated with the Nazis. They seeded stories in European media painting the Church as a tool of Western imperialism. The goal wasn't just to weaken the Church. It was to undermine moral authority in the West and fracture its social fabric from within. And that was just one front. The KGB spent decades spreading conspiracy theories, manipulating public opinion, and forging documents to create divisions. They fueled anti-war movements in the U.S., amplified racial tensions, and promoted radical political movements, not necessarily because they supported them, but because division in the West was a Soviet victory. They even targeted science. In the 1980s, KGB active measures pushed the idea that HIV/AIDS was a U.S. bioweapon, a lie that started in obscure publications but eventually spread worldwide. It wasn't about convincing everyone. It was about planting just enough doubt to weaken trust in Western institutions. And the most chilling part, much of that playbook is still in use today. Wet work, assassinations. Abroad, for all its psychological manipulation, the KGB never hesitated to use force when necessary. Within the agency, assassinations were known as wet work. Wet, as in blood. Targets included defectors, double agents, dissidents, and enemies of the state. Some were killed with guns or bombs. Others died in accidents that weren't accidents. Some were poisoned so subtly that doctors never knew they'd been murdered. One of the most infamous operations was the 1978 assassination of Georgy Markov, a Bulgarian dissident working for the BBC. On his way to work in London, Markov felt a sharp sting on his leg. A passerby had jabbed him with the tip of an umbrella. Within days, he was dead. Autopsy revealed a tiny pellet filled with ricin, a poison 10 times more lethal than cyanide. British investigators were almost certain the KGB had supplied the weapon. Other high-profile targets weren't so lucky. Stepan Bandera, a Ukrainian nationalist, was assassinated in Munich in 1959 with a cyanide gas pistol. Lev Rebet, another anti-Soviet figure, was killed in the same city with a similar device. And countless others simply vanished, erased by a system that believed no one who betrayed the motherland should ever feel safe again. Double agents and mole wars espionage wasn't a one-way street. Just as the KGB was infiltrating the West, Western agencies were trying to penetrate the Soviet system. This led to one of the most dangerous and psychologically complex IQ arenas of the Cold War, the mole hunt. One of the most damaging Soviet moles was Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer who began spying for the KGB in 1985. For nearly a decade, Ames betrayed dozens of U.S. assets in the Soviet Union, many of whom were executed. He revealed highly classified details about U.S. operations, crippling American intelligence efforts. Then there was Robert Hanssen, an FBI agent who spied for the Soviets and later the Russians for over 20 years. He provided thousands of pages of classified documents, including details about U.S. nuclear strategy, surveillance programs, and double-agent networks. Hansen's betrayal was so deep it took years to unravel its full impact. But the KGB suffered its own devastating betrayals too. Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB colonel, secretly worked for British intelligence and provided critical insights into Soviet operations. Adolf Tolkachev, a scientist in Moscow's military research sector, gave the CIA groundbreaking data on Soviet radar and aircraft technology before he was betrayed and executed. The Mole Wars were a game of paranoia and patience. Agents lived double lives for decades, never knowing if the next knock on their door was a promotion or a bullet. Technology and tradecraft. The art of spycraft. The Cold War wasn't just about ideology, it was about innovation. And the KGB was relentless in mastering the art of spycraft. They pioneered miniature cameras hidden in cigarette cases, pens, and belt buckles. They built dead drops, hidden caches in trees, pipes, and park benches, for exchanging classified material without ever meeting in person. They used microdots to shrink entire documents into the size of a period on a page. They developed encrypted radio transmissions and coded signals hidden in newspaper ads. They even used honey traps, recruiting attractive agents to seduce Western diplomats and military personnel, then blackmailing them into cooperation. Sexual blackmail was so common that Western agencies began mandatory training on how to avoid it, a kind of spy hygiene. And then there were the defections, dramatic escapes across borders, through embassies, or under the cover of diplomatic immunity. Some were staged to deliver disinformation. Others were genuine, but each one was a psychological blow to the enemy, proof that even the most loyal could be turned. KGB in the Third World. The global shadow war. While most people think of the Cold War as a US-Soviet standoff in Europe, much of the real fight happened in the developing world. The KGB was deeply involved in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, not just gathering intelligence, but shaping revolutions. They trained and armed insurgent groups, supported coups, and built intelligence services in friendly socialist states. In Angola, Ethiopia, and Mozambique, Soviet advisors, often KGB operatives, helped guerrillas seize power. In Latin America, they funded leftist movements and infiltrated US-backed governments. In the Middle East, they built alliances with Syria, Iraq, and Egypt, often competing with the CIA for influence. They even reached into America's backyard. The KGB supported Cuban intelligence, the DGI, as it became one of the most effective spy services in the world. Cuban agents, trained by the KGB, ran operations against the US from Latin America to Africa, often outmaneuvering their American counterparts. The collapse begins by the 1980s. The KGB was at the height of its power, but cracks were forming. The Soviet economy was failing. Its satellite states were restless. The Afghan war was draining resources and morale, and a reformist leader named Mikhail Gorbachev had risen to power, preaching glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. The KGB didn't trust Gorbachev. Some within the agency saw his reforms as betrayal. In 1991, a faction of KGB leaders joined a coup attempt against him. It failed, but the damage was done. Months later, the Soviet Union collapsed. The hammer and sickle flag came down over the Kremlin, and the KGB, once the most feared intelligence agency on Earth, ceased to exist. But its spirit didn't die. It simply changed names. Part 3. From Collapse to Rebirth. The Rise of the FSB, 1991 to 2000s. December 25, 1991. The red flag with the hammer and sickle is lowered over the Kremlin for the last time. The Soviet Union, the superpower that once terrified the world, is gone. And with it, so is the KGB. After decades of shaping world events, overthrowing governments, and spreading fear across continents, the most powerful intelligence service in history is officially dissolved. At least, that's what the world thought. The truth: the KGB didn't die. It simply mutated. The fall and the chaos that followed. The collapse of the USSR was more than just a political event. It was an implosion of everything the state had built. Overnight, millions of KGB agents, officers, and informants were left in limbo. Entire networks fell apart. Operations were abandoned. Secret archives vanished. Some sold on the black market, others locked away in vaults that would never open again. For Russia, the 1990s were chaos. The economy was collapsing. The ruble was worthless. Criminal syndicates ran the streets. Oligarchs, many with KGB ties, seized control of state industries for pennies on the dollar. And while the old KGB's name was gone, its people and methods were very much alive. The KGB's functions were split into new agencies. SVR, Foreign Intelligence Service, took over foreign operations. GRU, Main Intelligence Directorate, remained under military control. FSB, Federal Security Service, was created to handle domestic security and counterintelligence. It was the FSB that would become the true heir to the KGB's legacy. Officially, it was a domestic agency, focused on counterterrorism, border security, and internal threats. Unofficially, it was the KGB with a new badge and a broader mandate: the mafia state and intelligence for hire. The 1990s were a dangerous time to be in Russia. Organized crime exploded. Mafia groups controlled everything from oil pipelines to banks. Corruption was so rampant that it was hard to tell where the government ended and the underworld began. And the former KGB officers? They didn't disappear. They adapted. Some joined private security firms, many of which were just fronts for intelligence operations. Others went into business, using their old contacts to launder money or smuggle weapons. Many worked directly for the new oligarch class, acting as enforcers, negotiators, or spies for hire. The lines between intelligence, business, and crime blurred completely. But the FSB was learning something important in this period of chaos. Power doesn't just come from the state, it comes from information. And while the government was weak, the FSB was quietly consolidating control. They infiltrated banks, energy companies, media outlets, and political parties. They built compromat, damaging material on politicians, business leaders, and journalists, and used it to pull strings behind the scenes. The old KGB had served the state. The new FSB was learning how to control it. The Chechen Wars, FSB's bloody rebirth. The first real test for the FSB came in the mid-1990s, in a small, mountainous region of southern Russia called Chechnya. After the Soviet collapse, Chechnya declared independence. Moscow refused to recognize it. What followed was a brutal conflict that exposed just how weak the new Russian state was. The Russian army was unprepared. The government was divided. The war turned into a disaster, humiliating Moscow and emboldening separatists. For the FSB, this was a wake-up call. It wasn't enough to monitor threats. Russia needed an agency that could act, ruthlessly and decisively. FSB special units, particularly the Elite Alpha Group and Vimpel, were deployed to conduct counterterrorism raids, assassinate rebel leaders, and run covert operations. But it was the Second Chechen War, starting in 1999, that truly marked the FSB's rebirth. That war began after a series of mysterious apartment bombings across Russia killed hundreds of civilians. The government blamed Chechen terrorists and launched a full-scale invasion. But many independent investigators, both inside and outside Russia, have long suspected the FSB itself may have orchestrated the bombings as a false flag to justify war and consolidate power. The truth remains murky. But one thing is clear. The crisis changed Russia forever, and it propelled a former KGB officer named Vladimir Putin into power. The rise of Putin. The spy who became the state Vladimir Putin was no ordinary politician. A mid-level KGB officer during the Cold War, he had served in East Germany running intelligence operations before returning to Russia in the 1990s. He climbed the ranks quickly, first as head of the FSB, then as Prime Minister, and finally, in 2000, as President Putin brought with him the mindset of a KGB operative. He believed in control, secrecy, loyalty, and above all, the supremacy of the state. Under his rule, the FSB didn't just regain its power, it became the power. Almost immediately, Putin filled key government positions with former KGB and FSB colleagues, the so-called siloviki, or men of force. These were people he trusted, people who spoke the same language of espionage and loyalty. They were placed in ministries, courts, state corporations, media networks, everywhere that mattered. Russia wasn't just governed by politicians anymore. It was run by spies. The FSB's role expanded rapidly. They gained sweeping surveillance powers. They controlled anti-corruption investigations, counterterrorism operations, and border security. They infiltrated political opposition groups, monitored the internet, and clamped down on independent media. They built vast databases on Russian citizens, including biometric and digital profiles. And just like the KGB before them, they began reaching beyond Russia's borders. Assassination, intimidation, and compromat diplomacy. The new Russian state had learned a crucial lesson. You don't need armies to project power. You just need fear and the ability to reach anyone, anywhere. The FSB, often working with the SVR and GRU, began targeting dissidents, defectors, and enemies abroad. One of the first high-profile cases was the 2006 assassination of Alexander Litvinenko, a former FSB officer who had fled to the UK and exposed Russian state corruption. He was poisoned in London with polonium-210, a rare radioactive isotope. It was a message as much as a murder. No one betrays the FSB and lives. Years later, a similar pattern would emerge in the case of Sergei Skripal, a former Russian double agent poisoned with a nerve agent in Salisbury, England in 2018. Once again, the Kremlin denied involvement. Once again, the evidence pointed to Russian operatives. These assassinations weren't about silencing critics. They were about demonstrating reach. The FSB also perfected the use of kompromat, compromising material, as a political weapon. Scandals involving leaked phone calls, secret recordings, fabricated documents, and honey traps have derailed careers and manipulated governments. In Russia, kompromat is a form of currency. Abroad, it's a form of warfare, cyber espionage, and the digital battlefield. By the early 2000s, the nature of intelligence had changed, and so had the FSB's methods. The battlefield was no longer just embassies and safe houses. It was the internet. FSB-linked cyber units, often operating under cover names, began launching large-scale hacking campaigns against governments, corporations, and infrastructure worldwide. These weren't simple data theft operations. They were strategic strikes designed to steal, disrupt, and destabilize. In 2007, a massive cyber attack hit Estonia, crippling banks, media, and government websites after a political dispute with Russia. In 2015, a sophisticated FSB-linked group infiltrated the German Bundestag, stealing massive amounts of sensitive data. In 2016, U.S. intelligence agencies concluded that Russian state-backed hackers interfered in the American presidential election, hacking emails, spreading disinformation, and amplifying divisions online. The digital realm offered the FSB something traditional espionage never could: plausible deniability. Cyber attacks could be disguised as the work of criminals, activists, or rogue actors. They could destabilize democracies without firing a shot, and they could do all of this from behind a keyboard in Moscow. Hybrid warfare, the new doctrine by the late 2000s, Russia's intelligence strategy had evolved into what Western analysts call hybrid warfare, a blend of traditional espionage, cyber operations, propaganda, economic pressure, and covert action. The goal wasn't just to win wars. It was to shape environments so that wars never needed to be fought in the first place. The FSB became a crucial part of this doctrine. It infiltrated NGOs, funded far-right and far-left political movements, amplified conspiracy theories, and weaponized social media algorithms. It manipulated energy supplies, launched disinformation campaigns, and used private military companies like Wagner as proxies for state power. The message was clear. Russia didn't need to match NATO tank for tank or missile for missile. It could achieve its goals by eroding trust, amplifying chaos, and making truth itself uncertain. The return of the empire. Without the empire, by the 2010s, the transformation was complete. The Soviet Union was gone, but the state built by former KGB officers was stronger than ever. The FSB had inherited the KGB's playbook and written new chapters. They controlled the narrative at home. They projected power abroad. They turned information into a weapon, and they did it all while staying in the shadows. And perhaps the most chilling part? The FSB wasn't just protecting the Russian state. In many ways, it was the Russian state. Part 4. The Age of Hybrid Shadows, 2014-2025. By the time the 2010s rolled around, the FSB was no longer just Russia's security service. It was the nervous system of the state. Its tentacles reached into politics, business, media, cyberspace, and foreign policy. And under Vladimir Putin, the ultimate intelligence insider, Russia stopped trying to rebuild the Soviet Union by force. Instead, it sought something far more subtle and dangerous: control without conquest. This is the era of hybrid warfare, where tanks are replaced by trolls, soldiers by hackers, and bullets by disinformation. And the FSB is the architect of this new game. Ukraine, the great experiment. If there's one place where the modern FSB revealed its full power, it's Ukraine. The battle didn't start in 2022. It started long before that. After Ukraine's pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych was ousted during the 2014 Euromaidan Revolution, Moscow panicked. A pro-Western government was forming in Kyiv, NATO influence was creeping closer to Russia's borders, and the Kremlin saw a strategic disaster unfolding. The FSB was tasked with turning the tide, and they got to work immediately. First came infiltration. FSB agents cultivated politicians, business leaders, journalists, and even priests, feeding Moscow intelligence while pushing pro-Russian narratives from within. Then came disinformation. Russian media, amplified by troll farms and fake accounts, flooded Ukrainian and Western social media with narratives portraying the new government as fascist, corrupt, or a puppet of the West. Next came covert action. Unmarked soldiers, the now infamous Little Green Men, appeared in Crimea. Officially, Moscow denied they were Russian troops. In reality, they were a mix of special forces, FSB operatives, and local militias, all coordinated through hybrid tactics. Within weeks, Crimea was annexed without a full-scale war, and then came the Donbass. FSB-backed separatists declared People's Republics in eastern Ukraine, armed and financed by Moscow. Russian intelligence coordinated their operations, supplied them with weapons, and helped run disinformation campaigns portraying them as local freedom fighters rather than foreign proxies. It was a blueprint for 21st century warfare. Destabilize from within, deny everything, and achieve strategic goals without open invasion. Cyber warfare, the silent front line. While troops fought on the ground, the real war was happening in cyberspace. FSB-linked hacker groups, known in cybersecurity circles as APT-29, Cozy Bear, targeted Ukrainian government servers, power grids, banks, and media outlets. They didn't just steal information, they weaponized it. Sensitive documents were leaked at strategic moments to undermine trust in the government. Misinformation campaigns were built around hacked emails. Cyber attacks disrupted infrastructure and sowed panic, and Ukraine wasn't the only target. The same FSB groups launched massive cyber operations against the West. In 2016, they hacked the U.S. Democratic National Committee's emails, a breach that, combined with coordinated disinformation campaigns, helped shape the outcome of the American presidential election. Whether it changed the result is still debated, but the operation showed the world that the Kremlin could influence global politics from behind a keyboard. FSB hackers also infiltrated power grids in Europe, conducted espionage against vaccine research labs during the COVID-19 pandemic, and targeted NATO's classified networks. Their goal wasn't just intelligence, it was chaos, undermining confidence in institutions, sowing division, and weakening the cohesion of Russia's adversaries. Disinformation and the war for truth. The KGB mastered propaganda during the Cold War, but the FSB took it to another level. Instead of leaflets and state-run radio stations, the modern Russian disinformation machine operates through social media ecosystems, influencers, and bot networks. The Internet Research Agency, a Kremlin-linked troll farm, ran tens of thousands of fake accounts posing as Americans, Europeans, and Ukrainians. These accounts didn't just spread fake news, they shaped conversations. They amplified divisions over race, immigration, vaccines, elections, anything that could polarize societies and weaken democracy. The genius of the strategy is that it often doesn't rely on outright lies. Instead, it blends truth with fiction, mixes real grievances with fake narratives, and floods the information space with so much noise that people stopped trusting anything. Disinformation campaigns weren't limited to foreign audiences. Inside Russia, the FSB helped build an information bubble where state media dominates and dissent is labeled as foreign sabotage. Independent journalists are harassed, imprisoned, or worse. Social networks are censored. Foreign agent laws are used to silence critics. The result is a society where the state controls not just what people see, but what they believe. Assassination 2.0. Modern-day wet work. If the KGB was feared for its assassinations, the FSB made them more sophisticated and more brazen. The poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko with radioactive polonium in 2006 was just the beginning. In 2018, former GRU officer Sergei Skripal and his daughter were poisoned in Salisbury with a deadly nerve agent, Novichok. They survived, but the message was clear. Even on foreign soil, the Kremlin could strike. In 2020, opposition leader Alexei Navalny was poisoned with the same nerve agent on a domestic flight. He survived, too, but the operation revealed chilling details. FSB operatives had been following him for months, planting the poison on his clothes, and even accidentally confessed their involvement during a sting call. There's a pattern here, one that blends intelligence with theater. These assassinations are as much about intimidation as elimination. They serve as warnings to defectors, dissidents, and anyone else who might challenge the state. We will reach you, no matter where you hide. The economic and corporate battlefield by the late 2010s, the FSB had expanded its operations into another critical area: economics. Intelligence wasn't just about national security anymore. It was about economic dominance. FSB operatives began targeting foreign corporations, trade deals, and infrastructure projects. They hacked into oil and gas companies, sabotaged pipelines, and influenced global energy markets. They worked with Russian oligarchs to launder money, evade sanctions, and fund influence operations abroad. In Europe, FSB-linked entities quietly invested in media outlets, political parties, and think tanks, shaping policies from within. In Africa and Latin America, Russian intelligence built relationships with governments through arms deals, mercenary contracts, and disinformation campaigns, gaining strategic footholds without firing a shot. This wasn't just espionage. It was geo-economic warfare, a silent struggle to reshape the global order in Moscow's favor. Deepfakes and the future of manipulation by the 2020s, one thing became clear. The next frontier of intelligence wasn't guns or spies. It was reality itself. The FSB has heavily invested in deepfake technology, capable of creating fake videos and audio recordings indistinguishable from real ones. Imagine a fabricated video of a NATO general ordering an invasion, or a fake confession by a political leader, or a synthetic recording of a terrorist plot. These tools could trigger wars, manipulate markets, or destroy reputations, all without a single shot fired. And deepfakes are just the beginning. Artificial intelligence is now being used to generate entire disinformation campaigns, creating fake news websites, fictional experts, and synthetic social media accounts that evolve like real people. The battlefield of the future won't just be physical or digital. It will be psychological. Surveillance State 2.0 inside Russia. The FSB has turned the country into one of the most heavily surveilled societies on Earth. The SORM system, Russia's equivalent of PRISM, gives the FSB direct access to telecom and internet data. Every phone call, text message, and email can be intercepted. Facial recognition cameras blanket major cities, tracking citizens' movements in real time. AI-powered software analyzes social media for extremist content. Even DNA databases are being expanded for security purposes. This isn't just about counterterrorism, it's about control. Preemptively identifying threats before they materialize and crushing dissent before it grows. The state no longer needs to arrest every critic. It can simply predict who might become one and act before they do. The new doctrine. Chaos as a weapon. By the early 2020s, the FSB's mission had evolved beyond protecting Russia. Its goal was now to reshape the global environment, not by building alliances or winning wars, but by making rival states weaker, more divided, and more paranoid. This doctrine has three pillars. Exploit divisions, fuel polarization, amplify culture wars, and turn democracies against themselves. Blur reality, flood the world with so much misinformation that no one knows what's true. Project Fear, demonstrate reach through assassinations, cyber attacks, and covert influence. The ultimate goal isn't conquest, it's chaos. A divided adversary is a weak adversary. A paranoid government is an easily manipulated one. And a confused public is one that's easier to control. The legacy of a century of shadows. And so, here we are. More than 100 years after the Cheka was founded in revolutionary Russia, the ghost of that original secret police still walks the earth. The names have changed: NKVD, KGB, FSB, but the mission remains the same: to guard the state, project its power, and bend reality to its will. Today's FSB is not just an intelligence agency. It's a hybrid force that blends espionage, cyber operations, economic warfare, psychological manipulation, and state-sponsored crime into a single, seamless strategy. And unlike the old KGB, it doesn't need to conquer territory to win. It just needs to make sure no one else can, and maybe that's the scariest part. Because in the modern world, you don't need to overthrow governments to change history. You just need to make sure no one trusts the governments they already have. Part 5. The Future of the Shadow War, 2025 and beyond. So here we are, more than a century after Felix Dzerzhinsky created the Cheka, the original Soviet secret police. 100 years since Lenin said that trust is good, but control is better. And if you followed this story from the start, you know one thing for certain. The ghosts of 1917 never left. They just changed their names, their methods, and their weapons. The question now is simple and terrifying. What comes next? The rise of machine intelligence in espionage. The first answer is already unfolding. The next generation of intelligence won't be run by humans. It'll be run by algorithms. The FSB and its sister agencies are pouring resources into artificial intelligence, not just for cyber attacks or data analysis, but for decision-making. These systems can monitor millions of data points in real time, from satellite imagery to stock market shifts to social media posts, and draw conclusions faster than any analyst could. They can detect early signs of political unrest before a protest begins. They can spot subtle patterns of dissent in a population before anyone even realizes they're resisting. In the near future, AI might run whole operations on its own. Imagine a system that identifies a target, hacks their communications, manipulates their social media feed, and blackmails them into compliance, all without a human ever touching a keyboard. That's not science fiction. That's what Russian defense planners call automated active measures. And once AI begins to predict how societies will react to certain events, intelligence agencies will no longer just respond to the future. They'll start writing it. The age of genetic surveillance. Another frontier is quietly forming in laboratories and hospitals around the world: DNA-based intelligence. Russia, like many major powers, is building massive genetic databases, not just for law enforcement, but for national security. DNA can reveal identity, ancestry, health risks, and even behavioral tendencies. It's a surveillance tool more powerful than any fingerprint or facial scan. Now imagine pairing that with AI. A database of millions of genetic profiles could be cross-referenced with travel records, phone metadata, or medical histories. Intelligence services could track a person's relatives, predict their movements, or even identify them from a single hair left on a chair. And the scariest possibility? Genetically targeted weapons. Scientists already know how to design viruses that affect certain genetic markers. Combine that with state-level resources and hostile intent, and it's easy to see why defense experts call biotechnology the next nuclear. Permanent hybrid war, but perhaps the most profound shift isn't technological. It's philosophical. For most of history, wars had beginnings and ends. They were fought, won, or lost. But Russian intelligence is embracing a new concept: permanent conflict. Hybrid war isn't a temporary strategy. It's a state of being. A constant, low-level struggle across multiple domains: political, economic, digital, cultural, psychological. It's a war where there's no peace treaty, no front lines, and no victory parades. It's a war designed to never end. In this model, disinformation campaigns aren't just wartime tools. They're part of everyday governance. Cyber intrusions aren't isolated incidents. They're ongoing probes. Assassinations aren't acts of retaliation. They're preemptive signals. And public opinion itself becomes a battlefield, shaped and reshaped with each news cycle. The goal isn't conquest, it's exhaustion. A society that's divided, paranoid, and constantly questioning itself is one that's easier to manipulate and far less likely to resist. Espionage in the age of multipolar chaos. The future of Russian intelligence will also be shaped by a shifting global order. The Cold War was a two-player game, Washington versus Moscow. Today, the board is far more crowded. China, Iran, North Korea, private military companies, cyber criminal syndicates, they're all players now. This multipolar world is chaotic, and chaos is where Russian intelligence thrives. Instead of direct confrontation, the FSB will likely focus on exploiting fractures between NATO allies, between political parties, between governments and their own citizens. They'll form shifting alliances with non-state actors, mercenaries here, hacktivists there, blurring the lines between state power and private enterprise even further, and as new technologies emerge, quantum computing, brain-computer interfaces, synthetic biology, each one will become a new tool in the shadow war. The first intelligence agency to master them will hold an advantage far greater than nuclear weapons ever provided: the weaponization of reality. Here's the most unsettling truth of all. The next great intelligence war won't be about controlling territory, resources, or even information. It'll be about controlling reality. We're entering a world where deepfakes are indistinguishable from real videos, where AI can generate convincing fake news faster than journalists can write the truth, and where bots outnumber humans on social platforms. In that world, the most powerful intelligence agency won't be the one that collects the most secrets. It'll be the one that decides what's true. The FSB, like the KGB before it, understands this deeply. For them, power isn't about having the facts. It's about deciding which facts people believe. It's about creating 5 different truths and letting your adversaries fight over which one is real. Because while they're arguing, you're winning. Final thought, the ghost that never dies. And so, the story of the KGB and FSB isn't really a story about spies. It's a story about power. How it's gathered, how it's hidden, how it's used, and how it evolves. A century ago, Russian intelligence was born in revolution. A blunt instrument of terror designed to crush enemies of the state. Over decades, it became something far more complex, a weapon of influence, a master manipulator of societies, a ghost that could rewrite history without ever firing a shot. Today, that ghost is more powerful than ever. It lives inside the code of cyber weapons. It hides in the metadata of your phone. It lurks in the videos you watch, the tweets you read, and the elections you vote in. And most people, even most governments, have no idea it's there. So the next time you hear about a protest movement that appears out of nowhere, or a scandal that topples a government, or a news story that feels a little too perfectly timed, stop and think. Is this the world unfolding naturally? Or is it something else? Something older? Something colder? Something invisible? Because the truth is, the Cold War never really ended. It just went underground. And in the shadows, the same ghost that haunted the 20th century is still at work, watching, waiting, and pulling the strings of the 21st.